The Texas sun was not a gentle warmth. It was a hammer. It beat down on cracked, thirsty earth of Earl Johnson's farm, turning the air into a shimmering, breathless haze. Earl stood with his hands on his hips, the sweat stain on his work shirt spreading like a map of his despair. In front of him, silent and obstinate, sat the source of all his problems, his John Deere Model B tractor. It wasn't just a machine. It was his partner, his lifeline, the iron heart of his 200-acre farm. And for the past 3 days, it had been dead, not just broken, but dead. No sputter, no cough, no sign of life. For Earl, a man whose face was a roadmap of 60 hard years. This silence was the sound of the end. The year was 1944. The world was at war, and that war had reached even here, to this dusty corner of East Texas. It had taken his son, Bobby, sending him somewhere to a place called Normandy in a letter that was now 3 weeks old, and it had taken the tools of his trade. A new tractor was an impossible dream. Every scrap of American steel, rubber, and industry was being fed into the great, hungry maw of the war effort. Spare parts were just as scarce. The local dealer in town had just shaken his head. A new distributor cap for a Model B? Might as well ask for a ticket to the moon. Earl was on his own, and he was failing. The cotton in the west field was ready for its final cultivation before harvest. If he didn't get to it in the next week, the weeds would choke it out, and his entire year's crop, his entire livelihood, would be lost. He'd be forced to sell the farm, the same land his father had worked, the land he was supposed to pass on to Bobby. The thought was a physical pain, a knot of shame tightening in his chest. As he stood there, staring at the useless green machine, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It was the army truck from Camp Fannin, the new POW camp they had built just a few miles down the road. This was another strange consequence of the war. Texas was now home to thousands of German prisoners, captured in the deserts of North Africa. Today, a dozen of them were being brought to his farm, a labor detail to help with the hoeing and chopping that his broken tractor couldn't do. Earl watched the truck rumble up his driveway with a nod of resentment. He was a patriot. He bought war bonds. He prayed for his son every night. And now, he was expected to host the enemy on his land. These were the same men, the same uniforms that Bobby was fighting. They were Nazis, the goose-stepping fanatics he saw in the newsreels. The truck stopped and a young, tired-looking American guard hopped out. "Morning, Earl," he said. "Got your crew for you." The Germans climbed out of the back. They were not the arrogant supermen from the propaganda posters. They were young men, mostly, with sunburned faces and weary eyes. They wore simple work uniforms with PW stenciled on the back, but on the breast pocket of their shirts was the unmistakable eagle and swastika of the Luftwaffe. The sight of it made Earl's jaw tighten. The prisoners were quiet, lining up as the guard gave them their instructions. Among them was a man named Klaus Richter. He was a bit older than the others, maybe in his early 30s. He had the calm, observant eyes of a man who understands how things work. Before the war, Klaus had been a master mechanic at a BMW factory in Munich, working on both cars and the powerful engines for the Luftwaffe's new aircraft. He was a technician, not an ideologue. He had been drafted, sent to Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps to keep the Stukas flying, and was captured when their lines collapsed in Tunisia. Now, his world of precise engineering had been reduced to the simple, back-breaking labor chopping weeds under a hostile sun. As the other prisoners were led towards a cotton field, Klaus's eyes fell on the dead John Deere tractor. He saw the farmer's posture, the look of utter defeat on his face. He recognized it. It was the same look he had seen on pilots whose planes were grounded, on tank commanders whose engines had seized. It was the look of a man betrayed by his machine. He lingered for a moment, his mechanic's curiosity overriding his prisoner's caution. He walked closer to the tractor, his gaze tracing the lines of the engine, the ignition system, the fuel lines. Earl saw him approaching. "Hey, you! Get back with the others," he barked, his voice laced with suspicion. The American guard turned. "Easy, Earl. He's not going to hurt it." Klaus ignored the farmer's tone. He pointed at the tractor's engine, then raised his hands in a questioning gesture. He spoke a few words in German. "He wants to know what's wrong with it," The guard translated, a hint of amusement in his voice. It's busted, Earl spat. Distributor's shot. Can't get the part. Now get him to the field. Klaus, understanding the gist if not the words, shook his head. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the engine with an expert's focus. He pointed to the distributor cap, then made a gesture of something being cracked or broken. He then pointed to the spark plugs. His hands moved with a quick, confident grace that was jarringly out of place. He was no longer a prisoner, a farmhand. He was a mechanic in his element. He looked at Earl, then said one of the few English words he knew. Problem. I fix. Earl stared at him, then let out a short, harsh laugh. You fix? He said, shaking his head. Son, my own boy couldn't fix it, and he grew up with this thing. What's a Kraut gonna do? But Klaus was already looking around, his eyes scanning the dirt, the barn, the scrap pile near the fence. He was looking for something. He was looking for a tool. Or so Earl thought. What he was actually looking for was a simple, discarded piece of wire. And he was about to perform a trick that looked so stupid, so utterly nonsensical, that it would make the old Texas farmer question everything he thought he knew. Klaus Richter's request, I fix, hung in the hot, still air. Earl Johnson stared at the German prisoner, a mix of disbelief and irritation on his face. The idea was preposterous. A Nazi fixing his all-American John Deere tractor? It was an insult, but there was something in the man's eyes, a quiet confidence, a focused intelligence, that gave him pause. And more than that, there was the silence of the tractor and the encroaching ruin of his cotton crop. What did he have to lose? All right, Earl grumbled, more to himself than to anyone else. Let him look. Can't make it any more broke than it is. He waved a reluctant hand, giving his permission. The American guard, seeing a chance for a break from the heat, leaned against the truck and lit a cigarette. Go on, Klaus, he said. Show us some of that German engineering. Klaus gave a slight nod, and he didn't have tools, so he used his hands. His fingers, though calloused from farm labor, moved with the practiced sensitivity of a surgeon. He gently unclipped the distributor cap. The problem was immediately obvious, even to Earl. The cap, made of brittle Bakelite plastic, had a spiderweb of hairline cracks running through it. One of the cracks ran directly through the terminal for the number 2 cylinder. A distributor cap's job is to act as a traffic cop for the high-voltage electricity coming from the ignition coil, directing a powerful spark to each spark plug in the correct firing order. With the cap cracked, the electricity was arcing, leaking out and grounding itself before it could reach the spark plug. It was like trying to carry water in a sieve. No spark meant no ignition. No ignition meant no power. The tractor was dead. See, Earl said, pointing a callous finger. Cracked. Need a new one. Can't get one. Klaus looked at the cracked cap, then at the engine. He seemed to be thinking, not about the problem, but about the principle of the problem. He wasn't seeing a broken part. He was seeing a failed system of electrical delivery. He needed to bridge the gap. He needed a conductor. He began to search the ground, his eyes scanning intently. He walked over to Earl's scrap pile, a messy collection of rusted tools, old cans, and broken equipment. He rummaged through it for a moment, then emerged holding a small, unassuming object, a short length of discarded baling wire, the kind used to tie up hay bales. It was thin, flexible, and covered in a light film of rust. He walked back to the tractor. Earl watched him, his skepticism hardening into pure scorn. Baling wire, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. What in God's name are you going to do with a piece of baling wire? You going to tie the engine back together? Klaus didn't respond. He sat on the ground and began to work with the wire. He used a rock to scrape the rust off, revealing the gleam of the steel underneath. Then, with a focus that shut out the entire world, he began to bend it. He wasn't just twisting it. He was shaping it with incredible precision. He created a small loop at one end, then another loop at the other. He bent the middle section into a gentle, perfect arc. The finished product was a strange-looking little wire bridge, about 3 inches long. It looked, for all the world, like a piece of junk, a stupid, nonsensical little trinket. What is that? The guard asked, genuinely curious now. Klaus stood up and held the wire creation. He pointed to the ignition coil wire, the main source of the high voltage. Then he pointed to the spark plug wire for the number 2 cylinder, the one whose terminal on the cap was cracked. He was going to bypass the distributor cap entirely for that one cylinder. It was a completely unorthodox, jury-rigged solution that flew in the face of conventional mechanics. An internal combustion engine is a symphony of precision timing. The spark has to arrive at the exact right millisecond for combustion to occur. Klaus's trick seemed to ignore all of that. He was proposing to create a crude, external bridge that would, in theory, allow the spark to jump directly from the main coil wire to the spark plug wire. Earl Johnson, who had spent his life working on engines, knew this was impossible. It was the dumbest thing he had ever seen. The timing would be completely off. The spark would be weak. It would never work. It was a desperate, ignorant act of someone who didn't understand the first thing about engines. "You're crazy," Earl said, shaking his head. "That's the stupidest damn thing I've ever seen. You're going to fry the whole system." Klaus ignored him. He carefully hooked one loop of his wire bridge around the metal terminal of the main coil wire, where it entered the center of the distributor cap. Then he stretched the other end of the wire across. He bent the wire so that the second loop hovered just a fraction of an inch above the metal contact of the number 2 spark plug wire. It wasn't even touching. There was a tiny air gap. This was the final, baffling detail. Now Earl was certain. The man was a fool. Everyone knew electricity needed a solid connection. Creating a gap was just another point of failure. The whole thing was a waste of time. Klaus finished his delicate placement. He stood back up and looked at Earl. He gestured towards the driver's seat and the ignition switch. He said his 2 English words again. "I fix." Earl hesitated, a feeling of deep embarrassment washing over him. He was about to participate in this ridiculous charade, in front of his own farm, with his enemy's hands all over his tractor. But the stubborn silence of the engine, and perhaps a flicker of morbid curiosity, won out. With a heavy sigh and a shake of his head, he climbed into the worn metal seat. He looked at the German POW, then at the ridiculous piece of wire glinting in the sun. He felt like a fool. "This ain't gonna work," he muttered, to the wire, to the German, to God. He pulled the ignition switch. Earl Johnson pulled the ignition switch. For a moment, there was a familiar, gut-wrenching silence. Earl began to exhale, a feeling of "I told you so" already forming on his lips. And then it happened. A sharp crack of electricity, like a miniature bolt of lightning, leaped across the tiny air gap Klaus had created. The wire glowed for an instant. It was followed by a cough. A single choked, promising cough in the engine. Earl's hand froze on the switch. His heart skipped a beat. Klaus, seeing the reaction, made a quick adjustment to wire, nudging it a millimeter closer, his face a mass of intense concentration. He nodded at Earl. "Again." Earl pulled the switch again. This time, there was no hesitation. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then, with a backfire that sent a puff of black smoke into the air, it roared to life. It wasn't a clean, smooth roar. It was rough, uneven, missing on one cylinder. But it was alive. The familiar, loping rhythm of the John Deere 2-cylinder engine, a sound Earl had despair of ever hearing again, echoed across the farm. The tractor shuddered. The big flywheel began to turn, and the machine settled into a loud, grumpy, life-affirming idle. Earl Johnson just sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, completely stunned. He looked from the vibrating engine to the German prisoner, then back to the engine. He couldn't understand it. It was impossible. It defied everything he knew about mechanics. The American guard, who had been watching with detached amusement, threw his cigarette to the ground and stomped on it. His jaw was slack. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. He looked at Klaus with newfound respect. "How did you do that?" Klaus Richter simply pointed at the wire bridge. The trick was not just in the wire. It was in the gap. He understood a principle of high-voltage electricity that a simple farm mechanic might not. The principle of the spark gap. What he had created was, in essence, a crude external spark plug. He knew that the ignition system produced tens of thousands of volts, more than enough to jump a small air gap. In fact, That's exactly what a spark plug does inside the engine cylinder. He also knew that the timing didn't need to be perfect, just close enough. The John Deere Model B has a wasted spark ignition system, meaning it fires on both compression and the exhaust strokes. This inherent inefficiency meant the system was surprisingly tolerant of imprecise timing. By creating his wire bridge, Klaus had ensured that every time the coil fired for the number 1 cylinder, a wasted spark would also jump across his wire gap and fire the number 2 cylinder. It was inefficient. It was crude, but it worked. It was a piece of brilliant improvisational engineering, born from a deep, first principles understanding of how an engine truly functions. It wasn't a stupid trick. It was genius. Earl slowly climbed down from the tractor, his movement stiff. He walked over to the engine and stared at the little piece of baling wire, now vibrating in harmony with the running machine. He had looked at a cracked distributor cap and seen a broken part. Klaus had looked at the same thing and seen a solvable problem in electrical engineering. In that moment, the man in front of him was no longer a kraut. He was no longer a Nazi or the enemy. He was a mechanic, a damn good one. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Earl. There was relief, immense and overwhelming. The tractor was running. His farm was saved. But there was also a deep sense of humility and even shame. He, an American farmer, had been saved by the ingenuity of a man he was supposed to despise. A man whose country was at war with his own, whose army his son was fighting. He looked at Klaus, who was now wiping his greasy hands on his PW uniform. The German offered a small, shy smile. For the first time, Earl saw the man, not the uniform. He saw a young man far from home, a craftsman who took pride in his work, a man who, in a different life, could have been his neighbor. "Thank you," Earl said. The words came out quiet, raspy. It was more than a thank you for fixing a machine. It was an apology, an acknowledgement. A bridge, far more significant than the one made of wire, had just been built between 2 men. The guard, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stepped forward. "Okay, Klaus, let's get you to the field. You've done your good deed for the day." But Earl put a hand up. "No," he said, his voice firm. "He's not hoeing cotton." He looked at the German mechanic. "You work here," he said, pointing to the tractor, then to the barn where his other equipment was stored. "With me?" Klaus understood. His smile widened. It was a promotion from the drudgery of field labor. He was being elevated to a position of trust and respect, a position that recognized his skill. For the rest of that summer, Klaus Richter did not work in the fields. He worked alongside Earl Johnson. He became the farm's resident mechanic. He fixed the water pump. He tuned the engine on the family's old Ford truck. He sharpened tools with a precision Earl had never seen. They didn't talk much. The language barrier was too great, but they communicated in the universal language of mechanics, through gestures, through pointing, through the shared understanding of a well-running machine. A strange, unspoken friendship formed between the old Texas farmer and the German prisoner of war. Earl's wife would bring out an extra glass of lemonade for Klaus on hot afternoons. Earl started calling him Ken, finding his real name too difficult to pronounce. And Klaus, in turn, began to see America not as the enemy's homeland, but as a place of vast, open land, run by hard-working, decent people like Earl. He saw a different side of the war, a side where animosity could be replaced by mutual respect, where a shared problem could erase the lines of nation and ideology. The little wire trick had done more than just save a tractor. It had saved a farm. And in doing so, it had begun to repair something much more broken. The divide between 2 men on opposite sides of a world at war. The summer of 1944 wore on, and the strange partnership on the Texas farm deepened, while the war raged in Europe. With news of great battles and terrible casualties filling the papers, a small pocket of peace had formed around a green John Deere tractor. Earl Johnson's farm was not just saved, it thrived. With Klaus keeping the aging equipment in perfect running order, Earl was able to cultivate his cotton, bring in his harvest, and secure the farm's future. The fear of losing his land, the land he was holding in trust for his son, receded. In its place grew a grudging respect for the German mechanic who had made it all possible. Klaus, for his part, found a sense of purpose he had lost since his capture. In Germany, he had been a master craftsman, a respected technician. As a prisoner, he had been reduced to a nameless, faceless laborer. But here, working with Earl, he was a mechanic again. He had a workshop, albeit a rustic one. He had problems to solve. He had value. This restoration of his identity was a powerful psychological bomb. The relationship was not without its complexities. There were moments of tension. One day, a letter arrived from Earl's son, Bobby. It was a short, heavily censored note, but it mentioned fighting near a place called Aachen on the border of Germany itself. That evening, Earl was quiet and distant. He looked at Klaus, and for a moment, the German saw the enemy reappear in the old farmer's eyes. He saw the father, terrified for his son, looking at a man who wore the same uniform as those his son was fighting. No words were exchanged, but the weight of the global conflict pressed down on their small island of peace. But the next morning, Earl was back to his usual self, gruffly pointing out a problem with the harvester chain, and the moment passed. Their shared work was a bond stronger than the abstract hatred of war. The most significant change was in Earl. His initial resentment towards the prisoners had been replaced by a quiet advocacy. When other farmers in the county complained about the German labor details, Earl would defend them. "They're just boys, most of them," he'd say, "and they work hard. One of them, Ken, he's the best damn mechanic I ever saw." He had learned to separate the man from a uniform, the individual from the ideology. It was a lesson he would never have learned without the failure of his tractor. The war in Europe finally ended in the spring of 1945. The news reached the POW camps, and a new phase began: repatriation. The German prisoners were going home. The day the army truck came to pick up Klaus for the last time was a quiet one. There was no formal goodbye. Earl simply came out of the house and handed Klaus a small, worn leather pouch. Inside was a handful of American dollars. It wasn't much, but it was a significant gesture. Prisoners were not supposed to have American currency. It was a gift, a final payment from one man to another, a token of respect that transcended the rules of war. Klaus looked at the money, then at Earl. He nodded, a deep, formal nod of thanks. "Goodbye, Ken," Earl said. Klaus replied with one of the few English phrases he had learned over the summer. "Goodbye, Earl. Thank you." Then he climbed into the truck and was gone. Klaus Richter returned to a Germany that was a landscape of ruins. His city, Munich, was a field of rubble. His old BMW factory was destroyed. He, like millions of others, had to rebuild his life from scratch. But he carried with him the memory of his time in Texas. The vast open sky, the relentless sun, and the gruff old farmer who had judged him not by his uniform, but by the skill in his hands. Earl Johnson's son, Bobby, came home from the war wounded but alive. He took over the farm and the John Deere Model B, with its strange little wire fixed still in place, continued to work the fields for another decade before it was finally retired to a place of honor in the barn. It became a piece of family lore, the story of the German's tractor, the tale of how a stupid wire trick, performed by an enemy prisoner, saved the Johnson family farm during the hardest year of the war. This story, and thousands like it, played out all across America during World War II. Over 400,000 German prisoners of war were interned in camps across the country, and many were put to work on farms and in factories, filling the labor shortage left by American men who had gone to fight. In these small, forgotten corners of the home front, the great, impersonal conflict of nations was reduced to a human scale. Enemies became co-workers. Prejudices dissolved in the face of shared labor and mutual respect. The story of Earl and Klaus is not a story about grand strategy or decisive battles. It's about a small moment of connection that reveals a larger truth. It shows that ingenuity is not bound by nationality. It reminds us that empathy can be found in the most unlikely of places. It proves that even in the midst of total war, our shared humanity can be rediscovered. Sometimes through something as simple as elegant and as seemingly stupid as a bent piece of baling wire. The wire was a bridge for an electrical current, but it was also a bridge between two worlds, a testament to the fact that sometimes the best way to fix a broken machine or a broken world is to look past the obvious and find the simple, Human connection that makes